Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today to the April 21st edition of this current board's first work session. Thank you to all who are here. It's an important topic we're going to discuss, and look forward to getting all of your perspective and insight to help us make some decisions here. So with that, we will call the meeting to order. Mr. Davis, would you please do the roll call?
Let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance, if we could, Mr. Tullis.
You got it.
All right.
I told you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now we will proceed with the roll call.
Mrs. Eichholz?
Here.
Mr. Marks?
Here.
Mrs. Singh?
Here.
Mr. Summerall?
Here.
Mr. Tullis?
Here. With that, is there a motion to adopt the special meeting agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Voice vote, please.
Yes.
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 Thank you, everyone. Board members, we are here for a work session today to discuss the possible enhancement additions to our current construction project. And for anybody who is in the audience or who will be observing as we move forward with a streaming recording, we are going to be hearing from some consultants today that have prepared some work for the board to consider on financial options. So first up today, we're going to have our partners from Bradley Payne who are going to present some options, and we will help push their slide deck as we are directed there. I think Mr. Davis has got that ready to go, and we'll jump right in with our consultants for Bradley Payne to talk about financing options with the possible expanded scope. Again, we're looking at the possible addition of a performing arts wing and the renovation of a student wellness center. Those are the things we're going to be focusing on with these finance options today.
Thank you, Kirk. Again, Doug Dalton, my colleague, Zach Logan. We're Bradley Payne Advisors. We were the municipal advisor on our bond issuance that we did earlier, last year, I should say. And so today, yeah, we're going to, you have control? Oh, I have control. Thank you. Let's make sure I'm going. There we go. Today we're going to briefly give a little update on the bond market. Bond market has changed quite a bit since we issued the last debt for the project. So we're going to just do a little history dive there. Talk a little bit about bond security options, bond method of sale options, some primary financing analysis, and then the disclosures we won't go through from that standpoint. Just a bond market update. As I think a lot of people are aware, rates are going up. Things are happening in the economy, happening in the world. Construction project, I'm sure costs are going up from that standpoint. So we just wanted to provide a little bit of background over a certain number of years in terms of how and what's going on. This graph right here just represents going back from January of 2022 up to the current time period. So you can see where the 1, 5, 10, and so forth year rates are up quite a bit during that time period. The top graph kind of gives you the minimum and the maximum and then the change. So a lot of these are above well over 130 basis points, 150 basis points higher than they were just in the beginning of this year. The next one gives a good rate history going back to 1991. And then just kind of as the rates have gone up, the rates are still good today. They're still at historical lows compared to history and averages. They're just not as low as when we did our bond issue, which is part of what we're looking at here. This one goes back from 1991 until April of this year. So this gives us more of a 30-year average as well. We'll go to the next one. This is a year over year. So this looks back to April 21 of 2021 to April 1st of 2022. Again, as you can see, the 10-year versus the 30-year towards the beginning of January, how much rates have gone up this year. Next slide, just more data that we find interesting. Here's the 10-year history. going back up until April 1st of 2022. And then the next one is just the short-term benchmark rate, which we look at, and this goes back to 2000. And you can see, again, 2000, the ups and downs from the bell curve, and then heading into 2022, the rise in interest rates from a short-term perspective. Next, we'll talk a little bit about bond security options. We broke these down really into advantages and disadvantages. This is a voted general obligation bond, unlimited tax general obligation bond. This is what the district closed back in August of 2021 for $71,450,000. That rate at that time was average weight was 2.316%, I believe. So very, very good rate. Just advantages and disadvantages here. Typically, these are a lower interest rate, more secure to bond investors, longer maximum maturity, increased revenues for repayment. Some of the disadvantages with this type of financing is just timing to market. It takes a lot longer to go through the process from offering circular, due diligence, and so forth, and then potentially higher transaction expenses as well when you get into a general obligation voted bond issue. Next, we have the limited tax GO bonds. These are utilized with tax abatement compensation, tax increment financing, abatements, exemptions. These are a great tool to be able to utilize. It does not go against for voter approval. Some of the important things that you need to have is consent from the state superintendent. The treasurer must certify that the compensation will cover the debt service. And then there's enough operating revenue sufficient to pay the debt service on this. Advantages on this, it's not as low of a rate as a general obligation bond, but it's very competitive in the marketplace. An advantage, we also list this as a disadvantage. It goes out 20 years, where maybe a GO bond will go 30, 35, or 40 years. So some people like that as an advantage. Sometimes that's a disadvantage from that standpoint. And it's a little bit longer as well, not as long as the general obligation, but timing to market takes a little bit more time. Next, which the school is familiar with, a lease purchase option here. I just provided an overview. We'll go over advantages and disadvantages on the next page. Most importantly on this is the 3 bullet points down in the middle there. These consist of 1-year renewable terms, up to 30 years. So there's an annual appropriations here. So that does provide risk that it is something that needs to get voted every year as you go through this. So sometimes that can be difficult as things change within the school district, the board changes, those things that are up every year. And then the security of the district is form of a ground lease to the leaser. So that sometimes you're given it as a security as the actual ground, and that can be a disadvantage from that standpoint. So let me jump to just some advantages and disadvantages here. Typically, you've got multiple lenders similar to a bond offering when you issue this. It can be very competitive. It can have a good lower interest rate to it, and then it's up to 30 years for building improvements. The disadvantages here is it is a higher interest rate than a general obligation bond. You need to have some form of economies of scale, so the bigger the transaction, the better off it is. Higher transaction fees, timing to market again, complexity, got to have a secure revenue stream to be able to pay the lease payments, and then the biggest one is the potential loss of possession. Because you are providing a ground lease to this. There is the opportunity, if it wasn't appropriated on an annual basis, that there is that loss of possession. So that sometimes can be a big disadvantage in terms of choosing that financing. Next, we just want to talk about method of sale of options. This breaks down into 2 categories. Public sale, which is what we did with the issuance in August. It was sold to the public, to the investors, and then also a private placement option where it's privately placed directly with a investor or multiple investors, including what could be a bank. Advantages on this, you've got it's competitive, potentially lower interest rate that you would have versus a private placement. The district has the highest credit rating, so AAA, which is obviously very good. And then familiar process from the last bond issue, so there would be, everybody would understand what we have to do from a public sale standpoint. Disadvantages on this, timing to market. That's a really big issue right now with deals that we're working on across asset classes in a rising rate environment. Some deals that were potentially refundings aren't happening now, or deals that are in progress. Just from last month to this month, some are up 75 basis points. So that's a disadvantage from a timing perspective. Additional issuance expenses versus a private placement. Going through the rating process takes time, so that's a part of that timing to market. And then you do have to provide a formal offering documentation by the school district as well, which takes some time as a process from that standpoint. Next, private placement for bonds. Timing to market here is definitely an advantage. It's much quicker to get to the market, to be able to do your financing, dealing with, which can be a disadvantage. Maybe one investor or multiple investors or banks, but just not as large as what you have from the public standpoint. It is a competitive process. Typically, when we do these types of transactions, they're RFP to 40 potential lenders. So there is a wide breadth that creates a competitive nature in terms of what's being provided there. There's no formal offering documentation, disclosure statement, or rating through that process. There's more flexible structuring options that you have. So if you were to, for example, get donations or have other dollars coming in, that could be something with a bank or a single investor, you have a better chance of negotiating. And then lower issuance expenses versus a public offering. Disadvantages here is potentially higher bond interest rates than a public offering is going to have. And then documentation and legal fees. There is a lot of give and take going back and during that negotiation with a investor or with a bank, for example, that takes place as well. I know this is a lot. We'll get to a Q&A when we're done. I'm going to have Zach. He's our quant guy. We're going to allow him to talk a little bit about some pricing. Sure. I can move that to the lower one there if you want to.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Doug alluded to, what we're trying to do here is give a real good synopsis of what has been a very volatile market and a wide-moving target. There are several options from a security standpoint, as Doug outlined, that the district has to borrow additional funds in order to engage in new projects. A handful of those have, what we would recommend is much more competitive advantages in this market based on timing, execution, and the experience we had with other clients. What we've tried to do here is, just for perspective more than interest rate, given how volatile things are, show, based on our conversations with the district, where a placement versus a public offering indicatively might fall for annual payments on different terms. This slide is over a 5-year amortization, and we have taken indicative rates, as you'll see across the top, from a private placement standpoint, and those are just simple outlines of the total annual payment, assuming level debt service, the total payments over the life of the debt, and then the interest, obviously, is the difference between those two figures. To try and give some color to what different sizes of projects would cost over different terms at different rates. So rather than talk through all of these are provided as information, more like a rate sheet, so that folks can see exactly where things may fall over different terms at different rates, 10 years and 15 years. I just want to also really quickly highlight again what Doug said about how volatile the market's been over the past 3, now 4 months. A lot of the pressure is initially felt on the short end, with the Fed's increasing interest rates to fight inflation, not to make light of any of the geopolitical conflict in Ukraine, and the multiple other issues that are being fought. But in short, what we've seen is rates rising close to 150 basis points in 4 months, and the expectation on May 3rd is that they will continue to rise to fight inflationary fears and combat, really given that that's one of the Fed's two main tools to defend these metrics. So these are here as really just a guideline, and we can interpolate anything from there, but just trying to help give some perspective on what different options may look like. And I think that gets to the end of it. So.
I think just on those last slides, just as you look at the 5-year, 10-year, and the 15-year amortizations, obviously the rates go up from a 260 to a 340 or a 280 to 350. So the further, obviously, as you're going out, the increase in the annual rate that you have as well. Happy to open it up to Q&A.
Can you just do us a favor and go back to that the COPS lease slide quickly? And just for the sake of everybody here or those who may be studying this after this meeting, when we talk about COPS, many people may not know that schools use this type of option to look at financing. It's something that we don't talk a lot about. So can you just at a high level explain what this is and how general they are in the public education realm?
Sure. I'm happy to. COPS, certificates of participation, is probably best outlined on the previous slide. There are limitations set forth by the Ohio Revised Code on the amount of debt that a district or any authority can borrow inside of their tax valuation. COPS allowed districts, and as Superintendent mentioned, it's very widely used. And a lot of times to circumvent what might be constraints by either project term, timing, or just the ability to get around debt limitations. So COPS are a very frequently and widely used financing tool in the state of Ohio, especially by school districts.
Thank you.
Sure.
Of the different methods you went through, the whatever it was, 4 or 5 kind of types of securities issuance, is there one you recommend in this particular circumstance wherein we obviously have a bit of a timing crunch and pressure here, weighing all those factors, the advantages, disadvantages? Do you have an opinion on what's best for the district?
Absolutely. Did you want us to go down here for Q&A?
No, you.
Let's do it from here?
Yeah, sure.
Yep. In discussions with bond counsel Brickler & Eckler, we believe that the limited tax presents the best opportunity because even though it's limited to 1% of the valuation, so if that in round numbers is $1.3 billion, which means you get 1% of that down to, I'm sorry, a mill of that is 1.3 million. Several of the districts, underlying communities, and the TIFs associated with it, especially in the Kenwood area, produce a great deal of cash outflow that we could use to basically wrap around and still pledge an LTGO with that security behind it. So we believe this is the most secure, and by secure it also means would provide the lowest interest rate for the district and makes the most sense given the timing constraints and what we understand to be the goals to get these additional projects financed.
And this versus just a regular go bond, refresh me again on the major differences there.
A general obligation bond is a voted transaction through the public. A limited tax does not require a vote.
Got it.
And it has an underlying pledge. We'd be happy to get additional information from Brickler & Eckler that can outline exactly how the background of the LT
that helps.
works.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
So one of the disadvantages you have for the unvoted version is timing to market. What would that timeline be, and how long would it take us to put this into place if we needed to use this method?
Great question. A lot of the timing constraints here revolve around whether or not any of the options from a security perspective are offered as a public sale versus a private placement. Our recommendation, given the constraint with timing and a rising interest rate environment, would be to pursue a private placement with an LTGO pledge. That gives you the fastest access to capital and should still yield a very competitive interest rate. So to answer your question, Mick, if this were a public sale, it would be very similar, minus the voting aspect of it, that timing, to doing a voted GO bond. Still have a formal offering document, a rating, disclosure requirements, additional underwriters and working group expenses. But going the private route would eliminate all that.
So a couple questions. So with focusing on unlimited tax, it would be helpful to know if we took it private versus public, what is that duration, right? Because to some degree, we need to make a decision quickly, but at the same time, we do have a little bit of time, right? And Mick, tell me if I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, we've got, I guess the question is, what is that timing differential? And then secondly, what's the cost differential? And then third, is there a prepayment differential?
Sure, absolutely. The financing time period, typically a lot of lenders in the private placement realm will start to not participate past 15 years. So for example, if you were to tell us that $8 million is the project fund amount, and we go down to the annual payments, roughly $700,000 in this example, and that's too big of a number or too constraining, we would probably want to pursue a different option, or, you know, alternatively, if that's affordable and we can move to an even tighter term, we find that most lenders will participate inside of 10 years.
So let's say we were focused on a 10-year time, right? What is that timing differential for underwriting or take it to the market, right? So private's going to be 3 months, public's going to be 6 months.
Sure.
Right? And then secondly, what's the delta on the cost?
You got it. Okay.
And what's the delta on being able to prepay or not prepay?
I would say that a private placement can be from go to funding in the 6-week camp, whereas a public offering, probably 60 to 90 days, so 2 to 3 months, and a much heavier lift. As far as costs go, on an $8 million size, roughly, at least double for a public offering. That would include underwriter, rating, printing, disclosure, and not to mention all the timing and interest rate risk in theory. I mean,
and which market is going to be more volatile, right? In terms of, I mean, when you think about the public market versus the private market, in terms of, you know, the downside to interest rates escalating over that time period.
They do tend to track each other,
okay,
to a certain extent. Over the past 3 years, if you had economies of scale, if you had a transaction in the $8 to $10 million range, it's a business decision. Do you want to go through all the heavy lifting of an offering document, the timing and the rating, but knowing that the market's stable, probably the best route. Alternatively, the private placement route, you're under no obligation to accept bids from lenders once the RFP is sent out. When we send that out to the 40-odd banks, and, sorry, I keep going the wrong way, investors, if the results were not compelling or acceptable, we can walk away with no cost incurred. So from a public standpoint, you would have a rating cost incurred typically. It's non-refundable, but I'd say the timing's about double, the fees are about double, and if anyone has a crystal ball and knows where rates are, I'd love to take a look.
What's that last component in terms of prepaying on the bonds?
We have got a very good understanding with our lending group to accommodate optional prepayment to the extent that, you know, donations were to come in or funds become available one way or another, and the loan on a private side were to be called. Typically on a 10-year piece of paper, 5 to 7 years at par, so no penalty. We could take those bonds back from the investor without additional interest cost or premium.
Once we push over the 5 to 7 years, you're saying?
Correct.
And then what's the penalty during that first 5-year period?
It would be paying accrued interest through the date, so you'd basically be prepaying the loan up until that time.
Okay. Just to make sure I understand, then the security that comes with this bond, that is simply pledging of our tax or potential future real estate tax revenues?
Correct.
Yes, we would look to the TIF revenues that were being produced and looked at, you know, how long are those available.
So we can separately pledge our TIF revenue we receive as opposed to just the general real estate tax we receive?
I think there's a little semantics there. It's technically an LTGO, but the backstop are the TIF revenues, and that's what we've been working with Mick to understand exactly what is available from Kenwood specifically, and how much of that we could pledge against one of these options that would make the two meet and cash flow possible.
Do we run any challenges? Like, I know at some point those TIF are going to flip over, right, into normal real estate taxes, and I don't know when that duration is, but.
Yeah, we have that duration list, so that would definitely go into play in terms of how we model that out to make sure that they would be able to meet debt service.
If it's not pledged against TIF dollars, what would it be pledged against?
It's technically it is the TIF dollar backstop, so it would be outlined as such, and the investment community is very familiar with the. Get you back to that slide. How the I wanted to quote the correct section 13306 references how that is an LTGO pledge with a tax backstop. Yeah.
So basically, in order to do this program, we're pledging it against TIF, CRA, or the enterprise zone.
Correct. Those are the options from an abatement standpoint. And then the three items here are the ones that are important, to get approval from the state superintendent, make sure that the treasurer basically is signing off and saying there's sufficient revenue and we can do this.
So let's say we go with the limited tax go bond option, okay? That's what you recommend. Obviously, we'll continue to talk about that. We go with that, we pick a duration, and then how soon do we get the rates locked in? When does that happen?
We would propose to send out an RFP, a term sheet basically to all these lenders. Typically, if it's a 6-week type time frame, within 3 weeks or so, and we typically give them 10 days to review the analysis, and once their term sheets are put in place, we let them know what our closing timeline expectation is, and they need to hold the rate through that time period. So a month plus or minus, relatively quickly. And at that point, it does become more of a negotiation with the institution where we can modify and tweak things and say, we appreciate what you've given us, now we'd like to make these additional changes. We give them as best parameters as we can based on what we perceive the need to be, and then try to fine tune that once we get feedback.
So regardless of which direction we might go, is taking on this in addition to what we already have, would any of this impact our AAA bond rating?
This would be completely separate from that, and the AAA rating is very sustainable under these metrics.
What questions are we not asking? What are the blind spots that you guys see that we are not seeing? Is there any out there?
I mean, an example like this, TIF revenues, they can change. I mean, that's where you really want to make sure you have enough coverage ratio there that if tax rates did go down or something happened, that there's still going to be an assessment of those TIF revenues or TIF dollars to be able to provide sufficient revenue there. So, I mean, that's a part of when we go through this process that we have. So, I mean, you're not seeing it here, but that would be something that on the back end we would be looking at to see if there's concern.
I guess two questions. One, have we done that math? And secondly, it seems to me that would only lessen the security to the bondholder. It wouldn't, a future change in value wouldn't change our repayment obligation. It would just technically lessen the value of that security.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, because there's just less revenue coming in.
There's not any kind of like default provision in these bonds. If recession hits and the market of Kenwood drops, we don't trigger any kind of loan covenant defaults or anything?
We'll check with bond counsel on that and give you a better answer from their perspective.
I would just add that almost all of our clients are going through a very similar experience right now, where they're trying to, meet what were, originally planned expectations and thought that everything would come to fruition under the original borrowing amount. So this is not uncommon at all, and everyone is fighting fast and furious to try to secure funds as quickly as possible under the best means.
So from your perspective, from a risk analysis, you look at what we're talking about here today, and you see that this is something that is not being too overly risky as far as what we're talking about.
That is correct. Yep. Yeah.
Just to your point, what you just made, right? You're seeing a lot of this in other school districts. Not
Absolutely.
that it matters to us that we want to follow that. I'm just trying to get the narrative, what's going on, what you see in the marketplace.
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then looking at numbers where an annual payment would be here from a private placement perspective, for example, there's a lot of revenue coming in from the TIF perspective as well, so we don't initially see that to be an issue.
Right, so if, I think a half year off of Kenwood was millions of dollars, and 8 million, I need to go up a line, 8 million on a private option for 10 years is still under $1 million.
TIF revenue is currently at about $6.2 million per year on the 9 properties.
But to be clear, if we don't issue this debt, we're using those TIF dollars for other general fund purposes.
Correct.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yep.
And then a question I should have asked, I'm assuming these rates are fixed throughout the term of the bond, or can the rates fluctuate?
No, we mandate a fixed rate.
Yeah, that'd be part of the negotiation with the bank and so forth. So just like the call provisions and other things that we would want to put in there.
You guys did a good job with the other issuance, so thank you for that.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you.
You said this earlier, but how many institutions will you go out and shop this with again?
It's roughly 40.
Okay.
Yeah.
Approximately. And we've had very good participation from, I'd say, 10 to 15, but we never preclude some because occasionally their flow of funds is all different. It's very, you can rely on the bigger bank, the local Fifth Thirds PNCs, but then the Chases, Citigroups will come in, the Wells Fargos, et cetera, especially on a credit like this.
And Doug, can you speak to a little bit, just for the folks that are watching, obviously your firm works on our behalf to really negotiate hard, and and that's what you all did with the bond issuance with Mick's great work. Can you explain a little bit just how you would act as sort of the fiduciary for us? I think that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're registered with the SEC and the MSRB. So by federal, we have a fiduciary responsibility to all of our clients that we work with from that perspective. So we have the best interest of the school district at heart when we go to these. So yeah, it's working with Kirk and Mick and everybody, the whole team. And when we go to a market, for example, with those 40 banks, we're working with what are the ideal terms for us, right? We don't anticipate seeing a, not a large, just like when we did the bond issue, it's AAA, it's a very attractive financing. We would anticipate the same thing here. So we have all of these school districts in our interest when we go to the market and do those types of things.
Thanks.
So this is actually a question for Mick. At what point, Mick, can we see all of this, all these numbers in context with our regular operating budget, our 5-year plan, the current $77 million bond, and this?
So the current bond really is beside, exclusive of what we're looking at today, because that has its own separate fund that tax revenue is collected specifically to pay down the debt service of those bonds. What we would look at here is, if you can think of this in terms of, as we talked about going through the needs for more operating funds, we looked at our operating revenue and saw that it's only going to move up a little bit. We're going to have a very flat line as far as that moves, and our expenditures will move up at a little bit higher of a line, and at some point those two will intersect and we will go back into deficit spending. So what we need to look at here is how fast would this debt service drive us back into that deficit spending should we not receive any more lines of revenue in order to help offset some of the payments here. So as I'm putting together the May forecast, I am looking at some of those, and I can have some of those examples together, but I think from a very high level, it's really just thinking of how fast will those two lines intersect if we add a certain amount of debt service to the equation.
And just to add to that, Mick, is it possible when you're doing that modeling, we could look at a best and worst case scenario?
Absolutely. I can put together as many scenarios as you like.
Just the two would be good.
Okay.
other questions at this time for Brett?
No, I just think it's important to say, I mean, when we look at the 5-year forecast where it is right now, we're in a pretty solid shape, you know, in my opinion, to take on the debt service. It obviously depends on, one, what the amount is, and B, what the term is, but, you know, based off of what you guys are talking in a 10-year range or those numbers, I mean, we're not going to be in a deficit spending situation even within those first 5 years, you know?
Again, that's going to require some further analysis to see where those two lines intersect. There are some other options that we could use, potentially our cash reserve carryover, to help offset some of the dollars that we would potentially borrow through this, to save interest, total interest over time. So there are some other options out there for us to analyze and to make sure that we're spending our money the best we can if we choose to move forward with this, and then also with the hope that we can start another revenue stream in order to help offset some of these expenses.
If there are other questions that come up, we'll have a little bit of time, and then obviously we'll have some time after this work session prior to the next meeting. If we get further questions, we'll be in touch. Thank you, gentlemen, and they'll be here again until the end of the work session if there are other questions that come up during the next piece of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. So we also have our project team members with us here today, board members, and we are going to, again, just do a high-level, efficient overview here. Some of the images and renderings and budget sheets you've already seen at the last board meeting, and there are a couple of other looks, but we have our entire project team here to weigh in if you have any high-level questions. So if we can go through that slide deck, and I'm not sure if Amy, you want to kind of talk through that, but we have that. Oh, Chris, there you are. Okay. Have that as well. And I know that you just added a couple of new images from last week, but we could revisit a couple of those budget slides as well. If you would all introduce yourselves again, too, just for people who are watching at home, maybe for the first time, or who that go back and watch this later. Thank you.
I'm Holly McLean. I'm with MCS and Associates. We help represent the district in contractual and program management and construction issues. What we're going to look at today a little bit is the scope content that you guys have seen before, a little bit of the overview of budget and what we're anticipating, some of the construction trends that we're watching out versus time and budget, and then also looking at how this impacts your schedule overall.
I'm Chris Pacek with MSA Design, and we've been up here a few times talking through the different projects. So as Hallie mentioned, we just want to kind of give a bit more of an overview, some of the things that were presented at the last couple board meetings with the different projects that we've been talking through. So we'll pull that in. Maybe. Right.
Chris, before you start, I don't want to interrupt your time while you're presenting, but this is an interesting thing when you look at this, this graphic. I just want to point out we've had a lot of engagement over the last year with stakeholders, but prior to the last year, since the passage of the bond and levy, I want to remind everybody that there's been ongoing engagement about the current project with the Board of Education and stakeholders going back for the last 4.5 years. But even prior to that, and Chris, I think you were a younger gentleman and you were around, as far back as 2009-10, there were master facilities and site plans discussions going on about these same types of phases or concepts we're looking at today. So what I would really like to just say is some of this is not new. The ideas and the concepts are not new, and that stakeholders have been weighing in on these concepts for well over a decade. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So with that, like I said, really the couple different variations that have been looked at, as Kirk alluded to, this was kind of showing the current project conditions, and we relettered these a little bit from the last couple of slides you've seen, but the new middle school to orient everyone on the left, with the existing middle school gymnasium on the lower left, and then the existing auditorium sitting right in the middle, and the high school gymnasium on the right. The spaces we've been talking about are some spaces kind of behind the gymnasium. As Kirk mentioned, there was an auxiliary master plan that was put together a number of years ago that also looked at many of these areas and some potential expansions, dealing with both athletics and performing arts. So the area behind the high school gymnasium currently houses band, orchestra for primarily the high school. There's some choral spaces up on the second floor. And then next to that, in areas C and D, some trainer spaces, some used to be some locker room spaces that were moved out to the home of the Braves that were since converted to some wrestling areas. So those spaces, even in the current configuration, we continue to house those programs with some enhancements. And in the area B, which is both band and then behind that orchestra, some enhancements there as well to try and expand some of those areas as we've talked about previously. And area A, which you see to the left, was the idea of some additional music space that would be added on at some point in time to house larger expanded areas that would better accommodate the programs both for the middle school and the high school moving forward. As Kirk mentioned, some previous plans back in the 2010, 2011, there were some other black box theaters and these kind of things that were looked at, but always in this kind of same realm of music and athletics. And then the second version kind of shows the expanded. So if this were to be built out, as we've looked at here a couple of times. So if some of those music spaces were moved over to the area A, and that then housed band and orchestra, which would accommodate additional spaces for both middle school and high school, storage, ensemble, and so on. Then kind of reconfiguring the areas behind the high school gymnasium to provide more program area for wellness, some athletic needs as well. And so area B then becomes, which I'll show you here in a minute, some additional, like I say, fitness space, wellness space, that again would help with some of those program needs. You can see some of the prices on the bottom right, again, similar to what has been shown in prior board meetings and been looked at by both the project team, administration, and the board here for a period of time. So that just combines the two together in that sort of $8 million range. And then it's kind of off the slide there further down to rebuild the wellness areas in the back was about $500,000. And we can come back to these here in a second. So this, again, just shows the area that we built out with additional music. You can see some orchestra spaces, band spaces, storage. There's a lot of these small group ensemble practice spaces which do not currently exist in the existing areas, some common spaces, and really just, again, providing additional area, larger area to better accommodate current and future growth for these different programs, as well as helping support the performing arts.
Chris, is it fair to say, much like the process we went through last year with the major project, that again, you've created these renderings and views to show us an imagining of what it could be, and again, we're not in a final design stage with this, but we're trying to give the public a look of what this wing could look like.
Absolutely, exactly.
So there's still maybe some work to do, but we're designing along the way.
That's correct.
Chris, I could start it up, but on that note, because if we move forward with this, I want to make sure we have the same level of community engagement we did with the middle school and those plans, and bringing in our incredibly talented music professionals to make sure we do this right. As far as if, let's say, we start moving walls internally, how impactful would that be to the estimated budget? I know this is all kind of high-level estimates now. Is this something that we could do something from a design perspective that would add 20% to it, or are we talking it's all going to be relatively the same budget as long as we stay within this footprint?
Yeah, I think as long as we stay within the footprint and the general parameters, and as Kirk mentioned, this was still somewhat conceptual, and it's been able to take it a little bit further than that through discussions. So I think try to create some parameters and some guidelines around which the budgets were developed. So I think we feel comfortable as a team that you'll see some of the breakdown of the numbers.
And then I guess one follow-up, if it's determined that this isn't big enough, do we have any idea, I guess, from a construction spacing perspective, do we have room to go bigger? And then is it as simple as saying, if you add another 2,000 square feet to it, it's X bucks a foot? Or can we not do that yet?
It can't, like I said, there's room. It could grow. I think if we felt like within the parameters and and at least the initial feedback we had been getting from stakeholders, that we felt like the size and scale of the program, would be adequate. But sure, I think once we go through, some further development and further feedback, if we felt it needed to grow a bit more or something like that, I think that's something that could be looked at there. But I think, we felt like given the program needs and the parameters that we've been talking through, that we provided, room for this to flex and grow, whether it shrinks a little bit or grows a little bit, still kind of falls within the budget parameters that we've been looking at.
Chris, just for, again, general knowledge, I know you mentioned this last year. Obviously, you're engaging, you and Amy and the team, with our faculty at intervals, which is really crucial, right? They're all experts at what they do daily. But you also work with some other partners nationally that help you when it comes to these kinds of spaces. Can you just talk about that at a high level?
Sure. Yeah, as mentioned, there's some theater consultants, performing arts consultants, acoustical consultants that we've been engaging with as well, and trying to figure out, based on the size and scale, the programs that you have here, the potential future growth of the programs you have here, numbers of spaces, sizes of spaces, to make sure that we're providing the kind of flexibility and program needs that would accommodate both now and well into the future. So as Kirk mentioned, I think there are outside consultants that we've been working with as well, both here at Indian Hill, other projects that we work on, I think, to help kind of vision this and again, provide some flexibility both for now and into the future. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we did have a chance to, with some of the folks here, with some of the music department, to go visit a number of local program spaces both during this and during some early programming in the middle school, to kind of look at both here locally and some examples outside of Cincinnati, the kinds of spaces and program needs that they would have. So I think that played into this as well, as kind of looking at size and scale and what are the things that would ultimately be needed to accommodate the programs.
One of the things that Chris and Amy also did, along with Jim Nichols, is they took our Brave focus group around to 8 different sites where we specifically looked at performing arts spaces. Just as a reminder, again, some of that seems like a long time ago, but it was just last year in the summer. And we also learned, of course, that there are lots of other programs around the area that have upgraded some of their spaces recently. Some are neighbors. So that was also interesting.
Back any feedback they felt like, since we are creating this big space for them, how much feedback did you get from them, like the teachers who are going to be using these rooms?
Right.
How much of the feedback do we have?
I think, like Kirk mentioned, I think there's been a number of conversations that had been going on, both when the middle school is being developed as well as we've been looking at this closer. I think there's ongoing conversation that still needs to happen to really flush out all the details, and as kind of Bear alluded to, if we need to be adding or modifying, I think we still feel like there's space here to do that. So there has been a fair number of meetings that we've had along with the tours to go kind of look at examples of these spaces to make sure that we're thinking through all the different potential needs over time. So a lot of that has happened. There's still more of that needs to happen to really kind of hone in and make sure we're providing all the different kinds of spaces and needs that are there. But I think we feel comfortable, at least where we are right now, programmatically, that we're providing a number of spaces that are needed and areas that more spaces can be modified or added once we get back with some of those different constituents.
Chris, question for you and the team. Thanks for all you guys are doing. If we did need to modify, right, I have some personal feelings, that I'll just share, which is I think we do need more space. I think we need an additional performance space / black box. We've got a lot of awesome programming that we're constrained on. I know that when I looked at the auxiliary report, we've been going back for 10 years now, basically over 10 years, saying these are needs for the arts, these are needs for the sports. When I went back through that, it was almost 20,000 square feet of additional space that was part of the master facilities plan going back 10 years ago for the performing arts, and an additional 7,500 square feet for the sports. And so, as a parent, thinking through, we're going to do this one time, and we need to get it right for our kids, I personally believe that we're going to need some additional space. That's my personal thought process after talking to families, after talking to some of the staff. And so you guys have done a great job. On that footprint, if you go back, if you wouldn't mind going back to that slide there, if we had to add more space and other folks that are decision makers not feel that way, where are there opportunities, right? Where we know, hey, over here, there's no chance we could expand a footprint, but if we needed to expand a footprint, where would those places be?
Yeah, so primarily, I think even what you're sort of alluded to too, Nolan, with the original master plan was to the plan to the top, so plan north of A, additional square footage that could be added beyond, even going back. We're not all the way back to the edge of the scene shop there yet, and it can even go further back into toward the band field. And the other two areas that were looked at the time and still could be is plan north, again, the top of B. There was potential infill opportunities, and that's currently a parking lot area out there, both during that auxiliary master plan. At that time, there wasn't a lot of thought about moving some of the spaces out of the back of the high school. So that, I think, has allowed some additional space to free up. And the third area was to the right of the gymnasium. There's a green space. There's potential. We're showing potential future some turf surfaces and things that would maybe tie into athletics. But there had been shown there was an auxiliary gym there at one time that was tore down. So potential expansion over in that area as well. So there are a few places things could still push and pull, again, whether now or in the future, to allow for some of that growth.
What is north of A, right? What is, if you ran parallel to the backstage area there, right? What is that? Is that 2,500 square feet? Is that 3,000 square feet? What is that? I know you don't know for sure, but what's that ballpark?
It was around 3,000 or so, yeah.
Go ahead. So no, go.
And then the other thing I think that would be helpful, I brought this up in the last meeting, relative to this overall conversation, and again, the team's doing an awesome job, is, and you guys have already be working on this, is I think it's going to be important for us to look and say, what is the parking spaces that sit in front of the entrance to the performing arts that would sit in front of the middle school? How does that relate? There was historically 622 spaces. We're now going to have whatever. And then also talking about, if we move forward on the sports package too, what is that parking going to look like around the back? Because I think it's going to be important. I don't want to be in a situation where we don't have, appropriate parking. So I don't know if that's something that you guys can work up, but I think that would be helpful.
Okay. Just to piggyback on that question, I guess, too, and I know, Pete, I remember hearing you talk about this in another meeting. If you were going to look at designing that A differently, besides looking to the north on this picture or the west side of A, would you consider also that main wall, that south piece of widening, or no? I'm just wondering, just off the top of your head, is there a strategy to that? Because again, we're dealing with earth moving, the topography of the land. I'm just wondering what you think, because I thought I heard you talk about that big wall, Pete.
Yeah, there's a big retention wall.
Sorry. You want the thing?
I think it. So this side here is sort of, then the grade drops pretty deep coming around the corner. So when this goes out, eventually this tails down towards the back of this area here. So right now, we have a pretty good sized foundation coming across, and Soto, correct me, right around here through A, and then it's going to tear down and then come around the back. Obviously storm. I mean, I can't remember the details, Kirk.
I just wondered what you thought, when you hear that question.
Generally,
just so that we understand.
I feel like the grade back here is pretty flat coming off the back, where we even talked at one time, other than egress issues and stuff, is there potential to wrap around the back of the back side of the auditorium area and all the back spaces? But I know originally we had a bigger footprint that was discussed. We did a pricing option, and I don't have it in front of me, but for 3 different square footages, and we picked in the middle after some discussion about, you know, with the design team coming back saying, hey, we think that's the right square footage.
Chris and Pete, the question then, if we are, because I'm where Nolan is, if we're going to do this, I want to do it the right way, and I want it to be the best, and I don't want to have to do it again in 10 years or come back in 10 years and say, oh shoot, we missed an opportunity to do this, and now you're hamstrung. From a timing perspective, there's no doubt we realize significant savings in doing this project now, which, you know, puts a little bit of a rush on this project, which is unfortunate, but it's what it is. When would be the drop dead date we would have to sign off on square footage? You know, obviously we got to get to construction drawings, we got to get the bids, but is this something in the next 6 weeks we could say, okay, here's what it looks like if we add another 3,000 square feet or whatever, reconfigure it to do more a secondary performing space or the black box or something along those lines? How does that impact your timeline, the design timeline, and the overall project timeline?
When I did the cost scenarios, we'll get into that in a minute, I was thinking the sooner we get to market with A and, you know, all the stuff in B and C, we're going to save money. You know, we're seeing about, I want to say almost 3% per quarter. Compared to normally, you know, if I go back to where we're not in this crazy world we're in, you know, we would advise 3% per year. You know, and I think at the very least, what I would do is, I think, is if we define that this piece here is pretty solid, that's sort of pretty far along in design, because changing that would then impact, you know, as we're developing the structure. And this, Chris, this is our last sequence of building, and we're trying to overlap it with the staff and the people that we already got on site, to where the only thing we're doing is as this progress of work develops out the back, you know, we're trying to time it to where we can finish all this work up 4 months towards the end of the year. And, you know, to me, I guess it comes down to the question is, if it takes another month or two to vet out what it takes to get it right, you know, maybe we focus on this area. If this is right, we go, and then we still vet out the rest of this going around the back.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I want to make sure we have the time to do, is to truly look at this and make sure. I'd rather spend the extra month or two, and even if it delays the overall project a month or two, that's in 5 years, no one's going to remember that. But if we get this wrong, we're going to be living with it for a long time.
I think right now we're in a position where we can, if we can lock in, now this is the, I'm in the right spot, right? I can barely see. But anyway, we're pretty designed out through here to where we can procure all the steel, all the structure. Then it becomes a what do we do with the rest of this?
I mean, I think looking at it, to Nolan's point, the only thing that's really, because we've got the choir room, the middle school choir room, which I understand is not intended to be a performing space, or the black box that we call it. It's not right, no. But so if that's really the only thing, other than maybe some additional storage, that would be added, you know, are we able to figure out a way to design that into this project, understand the costs in the time that we have to realize the savings of doing this all at the same time? And I think you're saying we do. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I wouldn't want you to question a design just to save a month. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm impartial, but if I'm building a house and I got to make a big decision, I'm willing to wait to make sure I get it right. I'm just putting my spin on it.
Chris, what's a expectation you and Amy and the team working to continue? Because obviously you've done a lot of design work already. When you hear those questions, how do you feel about the
I agree
next
with Pete.
month,
I think,
2 months?
Like you said, this additional space is additional space, right? So we want to make sure we have it right. I think we've been internally as a team talking about May here, you know, trying to get some of these things squared away, at least as far as what's the scope and the program that we want to include in here, and ultimately what's the cost that the district has to decide on. So, you know, I think we've been talking, and with the end of the school year coming up, and people going away in the summertime, I think we're going to want to get this squared away here in the month of May. If that means taking a little bit of extra time to make sure the program is correct, or looking at a couple different program options. Hey, what if we had a black box? Hey, what if we had some of these other options? And doing that here over the next month, coming back with some some budget numbers to kind of say what those different options might look like. I think that's realistic. If we start getting beyond that, I think Pete will show some timelines. Then we start kind of running into, okay, can we get it done within the same parameters as this project? But I think if we can be able to take some time and take a look at this here in the month of May, that still kind of falls within the.
I mean, I think when we're looking at this, what we're talking about is really the potential, tweaking of storage space, and then the addition of the second choir room / performing space. Yeah. I don't think we're talking a complete, redesign of move it to the south of the middle school or something along those lines. It's kind of tweaking the process as we did through the middle school project, but with the understanding this tweak is going to involve expansion of square footage and certainly cost.
I think the biggest thing to think about and how you're approaching that is probably in the month of May, understanding what the final footprint is overall with square footage wise. There's opportunity there for more design with interiors and things like that, but actually getting the footprint of the outline is the largest piece to kind of settle on, because working through the building and foundations and understanding how far the grading has to go out for the building pad itself.
And I assume that then sets our steel costs, that sets our foundation package, it sets the stormwater implications that this will have.
Yeah.
And that's got to be the biggest expense item. The finish, the interior design, that's certainly going to be an expense, but that's got to pale in comparison to the main structural elements.
What I'm hearing you say is you need the footprint relatively quickly in terms of what the interior guts look like. We have a little bit more time in the design time. Is that correct?
I think that's fair. It's equipment, stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. I think to Holly's point, if we can nail down what's the scope and scale that the district's interested in, and that's going to help at least the rest of us keep moving forward. So if we can get you to a point where, okay, here's a couple different variations on what that footprint might be, this is one of them. If we want to look at something a little bit bigger, whatever that might be, then yeah, I think that at least sets us up and sets the district up well to keep moving forward without causing a lot of delays.
I was like, the main things I'm looking at right now is grading, foundations, and utilities, and making sure that we're wrapping around the building in a proper way.
We're going to go with, and then we can design it later, right? Is that what it is?
We can at least keep going, yeah. And just for the sake of the group too. I mean, there has been, because this is something this isn't new. I know the district's been talking about this. It's been mentioned for some time. So even before we started putting little chairs and doors, and there had always been a footprint that said this was a potential future. So just know that the district has been thinking about this, administration. So the team has put in place, knowing that there's potential some future expansion that was going to happen here, whether it's now or 5 years from now. So yeah, when in order to keep it going in the same path as the current construction project, yeah, those things need to happen here pretty quickly. But as far as is there enough capacity or is the site being graded in such a way, are the foundations being designed to allow for, those things are happening, and those things are being incorporated into the project. So I think the district can at least feel comfortable with, certainly if we can move forward with this as a team and get it going, great. If it's something that takes a little bit longer and has to happen in the future, there's nothing, we feel like we're setting ourselves up pretty well in the district that can still continue to happen. So I just want to point that out, that we can look at some different sizes of this and what's ultimately that footprint want to be. And like we've been talking about, I think if we can do that here over the next month, is going to help us keep moving forward.
Chris,
but there are things that are being done to kind of
you and Amy
you've
already moved into the high school MP room. It's just 1 or 2 more days, right? We can keep you there.
Exactly.
Because of time, we need to move forward. So if we could keep moving through the rest of the presentation, then we'll take some more questions, but we just want to be mindful of the clock.
So these are just some concept imagery. As was mentioned, this was still pretty preliminary, but it starts to give a sense of what these spaces might look like. And again, focusing on a lot of these other small ensemble, just larger scale spaces when you're talking about middle school, high school, and potential future growth. We also then started to look a little bit more at these wellness fitness spaces on the backside of the high school, as we mentioned. So again, there's been some conversations. We've had a chance to meet with Brian and some of his constituents, coaches, had some people come out and help us kind of look at equipment and how this might lay out. Again, still preliminary, this isn't 100% right, but at least starts to kind of get a feel for what can work. It just provides a lot more of the kinds of spaces that just currently aren't here. You know, Home of the Braves made was a big help in dealing with and helping with sports and activities out on the fields. But as far as long-term, you know, more weight, fitness training, these are the kind of things you're seeing a lot of other competitive schools doing. In some cases, they're building a standalone, you know, fitness kind of center. In this case, we can accommodate a lot of those needs right here in the building and make use of a lot of space you already have.
What's our ballpark square footage on the strength and conditioning and the cardio space?
That whole area is about 7,500.
Does that include the locker rooms or just the core weight space?
That's the weights, the cardio, and then like even that trainer. There's some storage and trainer space in the back there, Bear, too. So the wrestling is kind of, you know, off to the side. I think that's a separate, that's still another couple thousand square feet as well. And that we just for the sake of the group, we've been showing that kind of where as it is. I know there's been some work done there. You know, certainly there can be some rethinking of that, but I think the group has felt like that, you know, is there, it's functioning, and so that's why we continue to show it there.
So the strength and conditioning, this is in addition to what we currently have or replacing?
It could be both. You know, I don't know, there's been some discussion about, you know, does the existing space continue to remain? I know there's some programs within the high school that utilize these spaces as well during the day. So it's potential that they could kind of supplement each other or this could take over some of those spaces. But I think, you know, certainly the new space would start to provide a lot more and accommodate a lot more of the need that the current weight room does not. So it's potentially could still continue to exist together or independently.
Or it could be opened up for other uses.
Or it can be opened up for other uses. There's some, I know this is also being looked at as, you know, how can the community utilize these spaces as well, both for access. Nolan mentioned parking, you know, how can people get to this more easily? We're thinking about entrances. How could, again, other outside folks come in and use these spaces when they're not being used by student athletes? So just this, I think, helps with a lot of that flow as well.
I know that we're up for time, but I do think it's important that we look at this space in the same lens that we're looking through the art space, because, you know, when I went back and looked at it, and then I've heard, you know, there was an additional 7,500 square feet that they had talked about, and I'm not proposing 7,500 additional square feet because a lot of that's refitting, but, you know, if we are making an investment now, you know, I also think we really need to think through, is this everything that we need for the sports? I mean, in my opinion, right, Brian, and we've got great athletic folks. We've done a lot over on the Home of the Braves, but, you know, if I'm an athletic director and I hear that I'm going to get some things, I'm excited, right? But at the same time, we've got to make sure that, you know, I think a lot of our educators often don't articulate everything that they need because they know we're under limited constraints. When we're talking about being the best, not just here locally, but nationally, when we've got the opportunity to do it, I think we need to take a hard, quick look and also make sure that this is the right footprint. You know, I mean, I'm excited about the opportunity to renovate this, but quite frankly, our facilities right now that we have underneath here, it's embarrassing. It really is.
To your point, I think we need to move pretty quickly so we don't hold up the project, but we try to accomplish what you're just saying, so we can be world-class in the arts and in the athletic side. So it's
to your point, Nolan, quickly, Mr. Phelps has worked with several consultants already that MSA has taken some feedback and input from to make sure that we would be maximizing the square footage for strength and conditioning and wellness space, cardio space for the future, because a lot of gym space actually in modern facilities is wasted space. Sometimes people make cardio rooms, for example, too large, and they get equipment they don't need that never gets used. So we've been bringing some experts in already to do that. To Brian's credit, we'll want to look at maximizing every square foot, making sure we're thinking about how student athletes and adults train now and in the future, and everything from lighting to access to the outside to the types of equipment, and that's a commitment besides the design, right? But it's a part of the design that we really need to look at closely.
And what I'm concerned about mostly is, and Brian's done an unbelievable job, right? I mean, he was down at the future of athletics. Is, you know, we think about, we just opened up esports, right? That's going to grow like crazy. What's the footprint for that? You know, we're talking about the future of data analytics with all of our sports. That's going to trickle down to high school, right? Where's that space going to be housed? So I'm just saying, like, we need to think, okay, we got data analytics for sports, right? That's rampant now in college. It's going to be here. If we don't think Moeller and X and everyone else is going to have that, they are. If we don't think Wyoming and Madeira is going to have that, they are. When we think about our esports, right, I mean, kids are getting college scholarships for that. So I just want to make sure, and the list goes on and on, I just want to make sure that we look and say, is this the right footprint? I know the team's done an unbelievable job and Brian's unbelievable job, but I want to make sure, you know, if we need more space to be the best, are we going to be in a situation where we come back in 2, 3, 4 years and, you know, Mick's got heartburn because we're now saying we need to do something else, and that's not fair to anyone.
On that note, I mean, obviously the size is dictated here by the existing space. How challenging or how viable is it? And it doesn't necessarily have to be today, but if in 3 years we say, you know what, we need a much larger esports room or something we're not thinking of, is there capacity to simply expand on to the back, I guess the west side of this building, or would this project completely restrict that?
No, I mean, there's absolutely space. And I think it's part of the exercise as we're moving forward is, I think it's, as we look at these different variations, is we're always looking at growth, right? Where could it grow? Because the reality is, like, you're going to build what you can and what makes sense for you now, 10 years, 20 years. To Nolan's point, if you have to grow, where could you grow? So I think, you know, at the same time, we can keep identifying where might those spaces, if we need to expand, not preventing you from doing that. But yeah, certainly you could go north of here, or you can go to that area. I mentioned the grass area kind of behind. There's some other spaces you could grow into, for sure.
Do you have any opportunity to build up instead of out? Because I know we also have our green space issues, which I know has been changed a bit with the middle school.
Yeah, this particular addition will be difficult to go up on just because of the way it was built. But there's some other opportunities kind of in and around this area that you could, and particularly, especially with the new spaces that that would be built, allowing for that, if not actually going up now and trying to maximize use of that. Because you're right, the amount of area we have to build on in this campus is limited. There are some constraints.
And what about on the art side?
Exactly, absolutely. At least, if not doing it, allowing for it to go vertical. So let me just show you these. Again, a couple more images. These were, as Kirk mentioned, we've been kind of partnering with a few folks here locally just to look at how these spaces might lay out, just to see, you know, how it could work. Could it accommodate the number of athletes and students that we needed to? So there's some ideas about how that might be. Do you want to touch on this?
I think, again, we've seen this at the last board meeting. Again, board members, again, this is something you've seen before. It's just for the public, another high-level view of what we are seeing with market prices and inflation and how it impacts the decision-making around a project like this.
Yeah, I think there's only just one more piece that was added since you guys have last seen it. Later this month, OFCC, which is Ohio Facilities Construction Commission, the ones that do a lot of the construction and public works in Ohio and schools, anticipates the 17% increase for their cost index. That's just for 2022. That's usually diverted over 2 to 3 years of inflation, and then some of the regions are actually looking at 27% due to access to contractors and labor and materials at this point in time.
So we talked at the last meeting, you know, the what if cost, right? So we verbally went over, you know, right now, if we can make decisions towards the end of May, you know, this is all based on the 8.5. Now, obviously, if that grows, that would change. But what we're seeing is basically wait until Q3, Q4 22 is about another, is 9% above that. So your 8.5 goes up to 9.3. You know, what's that, $750,000 roughly? You know, and then what I did after that, assuming that we made this thing can't go on forever. You know, the crazy 21 and 22, you know, assuming a 3% increase that we're normally seeing, you know, that would obviously go up. So your price, if you waited to 23, is about $1 million. Just strictly between, it's not going to come down. And then obviously another 3/4 in 24. Conservatively going in. So how did I come up with the schedule? kind of like, you see the May, June, July, August of 23, what we're trying to do is take advantage of time while we're on site and overlap the back expanded.
I'm going to interrupt you for one second. That's why we need another space.
Yeah, all good.
No, I mean, let them do it, like we should let them do what they do, but that's my point, right? My point is we're here and we need another space. So that's, for anyone that's watching, that's exactly what we're talking about.
So that's good, good stuff. Timing was perfect, right? Yeah. So anyway, if we bump the project out, this red box basically explains that for 4 months of professional services, you'd be paying on top of what you're already paying now in the middle school. So next slide real quick, and I'll try to be brief. You know, we're about $250,000 caught for that red box of 4 months just on professional services. And for example, if you took 4 contractors, you know, because your painters aren't going to have a lot of cost, but when you start tacking on mechanical, electrical, people that are on site with material and equipment and general conditions, you know, 4 subs is about close to $300,000, you know, for that red box. And then I threw 3% on for the fourth quarter of 22. So at the end of the day, that's where I came up with the percentages. Going on, Nick, forward. That was it. High level.
Again, I think reinforcing the idea of the timeline, the cost. Thank you for adding those slides from last week. We just got a couple minutes left, board members, for final questions.
I think you've done a great job, and all along you have, so I think we have a very good understanding of what the pros and cons, opportunities. I think really we, as a board, just need to determine with Mick and the rest of the administration costs and how it gets paid for, because it, as we all know, it wasn't voted on in the bond levy, so we have to work on that.
Yeah, I just want to echo Nancy's thanks. I know this is a lot. This is an exciting opportunity. I just speak for myself at least, that I want to try to find every way we can to make this happen, because part of our obligation as a school board is to make the school the best it can be, and that's in every aspect. That's math, science, performing arts, and I think we're there today. I think our facilities can be improved to do that, so we're going to continue to work hard to make this happen, and I appreciate all your efforts. For anybody here or those watching at home, feel free and please do reach out with ideas, thoughts. This is a community project and we want it to reflect that, so thank you.
One thing I would like to ask is, we talked about a timeline of when the board needs to make a decision in order to sort of keep all that timeline that Pete put in his slide. What do you think what are you looking at as far as the board needing to make a decision to, if we wanted to move forward, in order to keep this project on the sort of same trajectory we are?
I think it comes down to if we could use that target for the end of May for that one piece of the backside of, you know, the one program section of Area A.
The footprint area.
Yeah. And then, you know, let's give you more time to work on the specifics, because the wellness stuff, you know, if you decide that you want to get serious on expanding this, and we know it's going to happen, it's just a matter of pulling the program and the pieces, the financial picture together on how to deal with it. That cash would not be needed until we'd have to look at the cash flow forecast we did. You know, you could push that decision down a little bit. Now, depending on rates, I'm not a bond expert, but I think you have time to do that. I think the critical piece is, if we're going to move forward towards the end of May, so we can start programming that space coming off that front half of that Area A. Does that make sense?
So from that design perspective, Pete, that's the answer. And just to clarify, again, that may not be the same as the timeline for the bond financing or the note, you know, option financing timeline. But if we're looking at the May board meeting, middle of May, and we had to extend even toward the end of May, we'd be okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And I just want to echo, you know, to all of you guys, MSA, Skanska, you know, Motes Engineering, all of our administrative team has done an amazing job, and thank you for that. And also, I don't want to speak for all of us, but I know in my gut we're all very committed to being fiscally conservative, and I appreciate, the fact that we're going to look at these decisions through that lens, but also balance that with the fact of making sure we're doing the right thing for kids. And I think Nancy made a really good point. We acknowledge and appreciate that, we do have to be stewards of the community's money, and that's important to us as well. So for the people that are watching at home, I think that's important for them to understand that we recognize that and appreciate that.
I think with that, we can move to adjourn, Mr.
I thought I got to do that. Is there a
You get to
motion-
do that.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
for your help today. Thanks, everyone.
Exclusive coverage on the Indian Hill Television Network has been a copyrighted presentation of the Indian Hill High School Video Department.